So as I mentioned before, Anna is the CEO of Open Data Labs. She is the creator of Vana, and she's a fierce proponent of the need to allow people to take control of their data, no matter how it's going to be used, whether it's AI or other types of downstream tasks. When she started to talk to us about what we could do together, she had a wonderful set of ideas, and we're happy that our technology has been able to start to fulfill some of the dreams that she's expressed to me for quite a while now. So I can think of no one else better to give the next talk. So thank you, Anna.
Hey, nice to meet you all. Excited to dive into kind of what a user-owned foundation model is, what it means for a user to own it. But maybe just first a quick intro on me. So I got into decentralization and kind of federated approaches through mining Ethereum pretty early on. So I was obsessed with central banks. Like I had a picture of Janet Yellen in my high school bedroom, and then like worked at the Fed in high school, and then got to MIT and learned about decentralized central banks, which were kind of these cryptocurrency networks that let you run compute from devices all over the world in order to do something that usually would have to be done in a centralized way. So I'd go get like GPUs from dumpsters that labs were getting rid of and just set them in my dorm room to mine. And what that got me interested in is kind of this idea of being able to have a large group of people collectively contribute to something that's just secured by like cryptography. I then went on to do research at CSAIL, which is MIT's AI lab, focused on natural language processing and kind of how do you best embed text. This was when I think a lot of the embeddings were not quite there. 2017, the attention is all you need paper had come out, but generative models weren't quite there yet. And the problem I always ran into was that the data I wanted to work with wasn't available. It lived in the gardens of kind of the walled gardens of big tech companies. And I'd be like, oh, I wish I could train on this or that. But it wasn't really available because it lived inside of those silos. So what we're doing at Vana is really using the power of individual data rights to take data out of those walled gardens. To start on kind of the importance of foundation models, I think there are two aspects. One is that they're becoming this new source of truth, right? So whoever kind of controls the data that goes into a foundation model is kind of controlling what information people believe. I think one example, if people remember with Google Bard, you could ask a while ago a picture of a medieval British king, and it would show you like an Indian woman, right? And I think a lot of people were like, oh, it's this crazy wokeness of the 2020s. But if there weren't another source of truth, people would just start believing that this is what had happened in history, right? And so whatever information is in AI is really important. And then the other piece is economic power, right? If you have the best foundation model, that generates a huge amount of revenue, right? It can do work that a lot of knowledge workers do today. You can look at like OpenAI's $3.7 billion in revenue as kind of a reference there. Typically, foundation models are trained on public data. So if you've posted on Reddit, you might have already helped contribute to AI models. But yeah, I guess for GPT-3, which is one of the ones where they were still being really transparent about exactly what data it's trained on, 60% of the data just comes from Common Crawl, right? So that's scraping the whole public internet and then kind of taking all of that information and using that to train the AI model. But that represents a really small percent of the overall data in the world, right? So if you look at kind of all internet data versus public internet data is less than 0.1%. And that's because most internet data requires permissions or sign in to access. Just as a person, if you think about where you spend your time, like it's probably in Google Docs and messages and email, that's not publicly available to scrape. And one of the issues that we're running into is kind of this data wall, right? Where state-of-the-art models are trained on 15 trillion tokens, right? And that's actually about the same amount of data that's available on the whole public internet. So then the question becomes, like, if we want to continue to build better and better state-of-the-art models, where do we actually get that data? Companies have realized this and have realized that that makes their data very valuable. So they've actually kind of locked down access to their data. Reddit, for example, and Stack Overflow, they changed their API terms to make it harder for developers to access. And what that also allows them to do is to charge more money for access to data. And so we're kind of in this situation where the places where the data lives is getting continuously more locked down so that those companies can earn from the data that they've collected. Something that a lot of people don't realize is that users legally own all of their data. So in the same way that when you park your car in a parking lot, the parking lot doesn't own your car, right? You can always go get it back. They can't like randomly take your wheels from you. It's yours. When you put your data in a platform, it's exactly the same kind of legal rights. So all of your data sitting inside of a platform, you can always go and take back. That's true for Alexa, 23andMe, Instagram, Google, even Tesla. That data is always available to the individual user. Sometimes it's inconvenient to get because they don't make it that convenient, but there's kind of regulations where they have to give it to you within 30 days. Something that could be a fun exercise if you have an Instagram account is going and exporting your data, because they give you not just like the images and your messages and everything you've generated, but actually also the AI labels that they've generated of you. So one AI label that they had generated of me was stressed but not depressed. And it's like actually hilarious. Like it's like a list of 300 things and you're like, oh my gosh. Like, so yeah, that's a fun exercise, but all that data is yours. So what we're doing with Vana is really unlocking this data from walled gardens through the user, right? So we're in this situation where each company has kind of a stronghold on their data set, but every user can export their data from across different platforms and pool it together to be able to create larger data sets. So how it works is that users export their private data from these different platforms. It's always possible due to data regulation. Actually, with the Reddit data DAO, which has 140,000 users in it, Reddit actually came in and was asking, hey, is this allowed? And they actually tried to shut it down. But because of individual data rights, where the users have access to their own data, it was able to stay up. And then users pool their data into verified pools, and they're able to make decisions over how the collective data set is used, right? So if you just have like only my data, it's not that useful for training an AI model because it's not enough data. So basically these data DAOs, DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization, but you can kind of think of it as a labor union for data, where people are able to take collective action over this overall data set. And that's enforced at like a cryptographic level. So yeah, there's a bunch of different kind of available data across all the different data DAOs. Nick showed some of them. So there are about 50 people full-time just building data DAOs on Vana. So each of these teams is kind of led by their own leader. The Tesla data DAO is one of the first venture-backed ones, so they're collecting Tesla data. There's also, Telegram, which has message data, Spotify, a bunch of music data. And so, I can share a URL where you can go explore the data DAOs if you want to contribute to them too. And if you want to start a data DAO, you don't need anybody's permission because you are using individual data rights, right? So you don't need to ask Spotify if you can start the Spotify data DAO because individual users have that right. I think it can be good to kind of look at high-level benchmarks of like how much data is there really in these different platforms. So if you compare Llama 3 training data of like 15 trillion tokens with 100 million users who contribute data exports from 5 different platforms, you can have 30 times as much training data than any single centralized company has, right? So it's really a huge amount of data. Obviously, 100 million people, that is an undertaking, right? We're 1% of the way there, but we're not there yet. But you really can sort of have a much bigger data set than any single company. Users also have a lot of compute. So actually, if you look at, I don't know, are people familiar with like the Ethereum mining process? Maybe to some extent, just that it uses GPUs. Okay, cool. So like if you look, I mean, now it doesn't use GPUs anymore, but back when they were still using GPUs, if you add up all of the compute that they were contributing, it's actually 50 times more than the estimated compute to train GPT-4, right? And obviously, there are kind of efficiency questions of can you use this compute as efficiently as possible, but even if you take a 10x hit in efficiency, you still have 5 times more compute, right? And so I think this is an important kind of benchmark to keep in mind as well. And then once you have those kind of model weights where you've trained the best foundation model with all users contributing data, you can have collective governance and ownership. So users get paid when the model is used or paid proportionally to how much their data improved the model. The collective can set usage rates so they can decide who's allowed to access the model, what sort of controls should be in place. And you can also have national models that represent kind of different cultures and ideologies. So I think a lot of people assume that foundation models tend towards monopolies, and it can only be built by kind of these single companies because it takes so much research, data, and compute. And it's tempting to say, okay, we're just going to take the open source models and try to make them a little bit better. But we actually kind of, as a collective group of like users and researchers, actually have the most data than any single company, right? And so if you can solve that coordination problem, you really can train the best AI model. So following on kind of the Vana Flower partnership, really what we're doing is combining Vana's focus on data and really aggregating all this data into these different data unions, and Flower's expertise as this leading federated training framework, right? You need to be able to train a model in some way across all these different data DAOs. I think too, like, I remember when I first saw that Flower had achieved, it was just the 1 billion parameter model in a distributed way, but I was like, that's amazing. Like, I think a lot of people assumed that wouldn't be possible, right? Even a year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago, people were like, oh, maybe you can do fine tuning, but the foundation model stuff is gonna be really hard. But they've really proven this out in a very impressive way. So yeah, the first user-owned foundation model, which we've named Collective One, is important for a few different reasons. So the first is that it's the first of its kind to be going beyond this web scrape data. That's pretty much all of what people use today for the leading LLMs, but instead you're able to access this user-contributed private data that even the centralized companies don't train on. So I think often people might assume, oh, Facebook could train on Facebook messages, right? It's sitting in their servers, but they actually aren't able to do that. My co-founder, he used to work at Appen, which is the big company that sells data to big tech. And there were cases where some of the big tech companies were buying message data from their own platforms because they didn't have the legal right to train on it. So you actually do have a lot more data available in this way. Second is user ownership and control, right? So you have these foundation models that are increasingly playing a large economic role in society and giving users true control over both getting paid as they help to kind of contribute to the AI model and as it gets used, and also deciding what should be allowed or not allowed for the model. And this is really breaking through the data wall that currently kind of limits the largest AI companies. Because of the new ChatGPT Studio Ghibli thing, I just generated some of these to see how it looks. So yeah, this is just a Studio Ghibli interlude. Okay, and then the end goal. So I actually think this is a really important point where I think that often the open source community today takes the approach of almost how do we catch up to the best benchmark that the big labs have, right? And the best goal in mind is how do we get as good as them? But really the question should actually be how can we be 10 times, 100 times better than any kind of centralized company can necessarily create? So the reason why this Collective One model is so important is that it really offers this path towards 100 million users contributing data and kind of creating this pool of training data that's larger than any single company. And I think that that's very important in this context of AI playing a larger and larger economic role in society. In terms of how kind of training Collective One works, basically users contribute data to these different data DAOs on Vana. There are 1.3 million users who've already done this, so you have a whole bunch of different data DAOs already there. And the data remains in secure compute that's controlled by the DAOs. So each of these kind of unions is basically controlling their data pool. And they can then grant access to say, I want to contribute to Collective One. And then Flower's federated framework runs inside that secure compute environment to actually run the training and then passes back those weight updates. And you can scale this process to millions of contributing users. Kind of going into a little bit more of the detail. So when a user contributes data to a data DAO, they're encrypting their data with a key that's controlled by the DAO. What that allows for is when the DAO approves code to run on their data, they're able to say, okay, this code is allowed to run this federated training code, and then that code gets run in the secure environment, but only the output leaves. Something I'll mention too is that the data is verified. So one of the issues you have with any sort of group of people pooling their data is that, say all of us are pooling like our WhatsApp messages. Someone who wants to take more ownership of the data set could try to pretend to be like 100 people and contribute a bunch of data that's not actually good. So there's something called proof of contribution, which runs on Vana, where every data point that's going into a DAO actually has to be verified for that specific data DAO's requirements. And that also involves kind of valuing the data set relative to each other. So for Reddit, for example, it was based on the square root of your karma. If you have more karma, your data is kind of proportionally more valuable. For the 23andMe one, they treat everybody's data equally. And then, for each DAO, you kind of have the secure compute environment, which can decrypt the data and run that federated training. And then the weight updates are combined across DAOs. I wanted to talk about some future research areas as well. So one is federated inference, right? So once you have, suppose collective 5 is better than GPT-7, right? Suppose you're kind of out there and you have an extremely powerful AI model. Then the question is how do you ensure an extreme level of control? So Vana is relying on trusted execution environments for this code. If you have billions of dollars worth of model weights in there, you kind of want more security than that. So actually being able to split the model weights across different compute environments and then run federated inference, there are kind of some scalability issues here and performance issues. The other is data quality evaluation. So right now, the data quality evaluation happens just at the data DAO level, where as it comes into the data DAO is scoring it, and then a collective one can kind of access that data. I think in an ideal case, having actually model influence functions where you're measuring at an individual level each user's data contribution and how much it's helped. So improved privacy frameworks I'll mention as well. So for these model weights, sort of keeping it in a secure environment and then making sure that inference is someone's not running very strategic inference calls to kind of try to recreate the data. So that's kind of the security requirement today, but I think having better and better PII and kind of privacy frameworks to manage that. Fourth, full edge compute. So not just training in the data DAO secure environment, but actually being able to train on end user devices. I think this is much further out, but I think is kind of good to keep in mind. And then I'll also mention health specific data because I think that's one place where things are really constrained. And it actually allows me to also talk about kind of the unique regulatory framework of Vana, where the user is acting as their own data processor. If you kind of have worked with data regulation, what that means is that the user is their own data processor and data controller. I think a good analogy is if you've used Bitcoin or Ethereum, Bitcoin isn't acting as your bank. You are your own bank because you're kind of controlling the private key. And in the same way, Vana does that for data. So it actually turns the user into this data processor, which allows you to work with really private data, medical records, kind of other patient-contributed medical information. So if you want to learn more, here are some details on kind of the partnership, the Flower docs, and the Vana docs. Also, if you have data requests or ideas, there are always people kind of looking to start a new data DAO and focus on a new data set. So just send that. Literally just email me what data you want, and we'll find someone who can start a DAO to try to get it for you. And yeah, happy to take any questions or anything that might be top of mind.
So we have a panel coming up right next, and so perhaps we can take a few questions while we set up for the panel. I think that would work. While we take a few questions, maybe Patrick first. We can set up for the panel. Okay, sorry.
Thanks for the interesting talk. So I've got two quick questions. First, what if users steal the data and they contribute to the system, because there's no verification mechanism to check the ownership of the data, one. And then who runs the DAO? It seems to me that the data is revealed to whoever runs the DAO, unless TE is running that. Thanks.
Yeah, so on the first question, from an ownership perspective, that's checked in proof of contribution, and the data sets do it different ways. So with Reddit, for example, they require that you put a code in your bio to basically prove that it's actually your data. And then in other cases, like there's one that's doing exports of ChatGPT, and that checks proof of ownership by having, when you get the export, you get an email, and you basically have to forward that email to show that it's actually your data that controls the account. But it depends per data set. Some, if you're familiar with any like ZK technology, some are using ZK-TLS. The Amazon one is generating a ZK-proof client side. So it depends, and I can actually send you some links to how different like data DAOs are doing it, because that check is really important. If an account were, so if somebody had hacked your Spotify account and they had full control of it, they could contribute, right? So that doesn't protect against that, but it does protect against, are you actually the controller of this account? And then on the compute side, I think this is always this question, right? Of like, you can have like, where do you work with data that is unencrypted, right? And so the guarantee that a TE provides is that nobody can actually get inside of that environment and see the data. And so there's a network of different TEEs that are running these operations. It's more constrained what you're able to do in them, but that does provide kind of a strong guarantee. And then the other thing I'll mention is at the individual level, in some cases, people are just running things client-side on an individual user's data to then submit a proof to kind of show data quality.
Let's just take one more. I think, Patrick, you had your hand up, so.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. So great talk, first of all. I had a question about the attribution of revenue associated with data itself. So it sounded like you were doing some kind of data quality at the outset in terms of establishing what the value was of that data. But for different downstream tasks, I would assume that that can vary a little bit. So how configurable is that, and how do you actually attribute that after the fact?
Yeah, so it's done at the smart contract level, and okay. I abstracted a lot of the blockchain stuff away for this group, but I'm also happy to like dive into that too. There's actually, so the Reddit model, there's an ex-Google Brain ML engineer who trained a model that honestly is mostly just good at shitposting because it's on Reddit data. But the way that works is that he created, so you have these data set specific tokens which govern the data sets. They kind of represent ownership of the data set. You can also create AI model specific tokens if you want, it's not required. And then you can require that that is burned every time you are running inference on that AI model. And so then everyone who's holding that kind of proportionally their ownership goes up. But it's pretty flexible. And if you know like Solidity or Viper, which are two programming languages for these smart contracts, you can use those. But we also have some templates to make it easy.
Thank you very much.
I think we can transition into the panel now because most of these questions are really going to surface as we explore. So could our panel members now come up? Oh, let's thank Anna again for that great talk. It's really inspirational.